Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing Nancy Drew, Message in a Haunted Mansion. I'm going to be comparing the novel from 1994 with the computer game that was released in the year 2000. Naturally, a spoiler alert is in effect as I'm going to be going through the details of the two stories, including the culprits. And with that, I'll begin. So I'll start by looking at the book. This is from the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories, the paperback, which continue after the yellow hardback series. The first two games are based on Files, which are a different series from this one, so her interactive changed directions a little bit. This is case number 122, and it is aptly titled The Message in the Haunted Mansion. So in this story, Nancy, Hannah, Bess, and George are invited by Rose Green to come to San Francisco and help her with renovating a Victorian mansion. She's hoping to turn it into a B&B. And while they're helping with the renovations and doing research on the old building, they discover that it was formerly the Golden Gardenia Hotel. Now there have been constant accidents. They began before the group arrived and have continued after. And Nancy and her friends suspect that it's sabotage. They find evidence that things weren't just accidents. And as they continue to do their investigation while renovating, they begin to suspect that the perpetrator is hoping to find hidden gold. So the characters in this story include Rose Green. So she's an old friend of Hannah, and she's spent her life savings to buy this mansion so that she can transform it into a B&B. We also have her niece, Abby. I've given her the last name Green simply because they are relatives, but they don't actually indicate her last name in the book. So she's a fair bit younger, and she helps she helps Rose by providing some of her own money to help buy this mansion. Then there's Charlie Weber. He's an older gentleman with a limp, and he's helping with the renovations. He's a little surly, but also seems to really enjoy the work he's doing. Next we have Lewis Chandler. He owns a store, which he does call a store in the book, called Chandler Interiors, and he focuses on antiques. That's sort of his specialty. And he's there to help advise Rose. He and Rose also seem to have a thing for one another. They're all kind of sweet to each other. Lewis is often buying roses for his Rose. Next we have Emily Foxworth, who's a friend of both Hannah and Nancy and has met at least George on a previous visit to San Francisco. And she's a photojournalist and is sort of a source of information on the history of San Francisco for the group. Next we have Mary Lee and her family. Mary Lee is a teenager who works part-time at her family's Chinese restaurant. And I've included them in the list of characters because the group goes to the restaurant a couple of times and the family winds up being a source of information. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And finally we have Tim Coletti. He's a young man sort of just out of high school who Nancy and the girls see occasionally, and it turns out that he's secretly living in a hidden room in the basement of the mansion that Rose has bought. One of the aspects of the story that I think is really neat is they put in some real history. So the 1906 earthquake that really devastated San Francisco is mentioned because when that happened, a lot of buildings were destroyed, historical information was lost, and they tie that in with when they're trying to find out information about the mansion, they have difficulties because they don't have those records. They've also created, I'm going to call them fictional historical figures, who play a key story or key role in this story. And that's Lizzie Applegate and Al Diablo. And it's these two figures that are really tied in with the hidden gold. And the last sort of thing I'll note is that in this story there are multiple culprits. Lewis Chandler is our main culprit, but he gets some help. And I'll get into those details after we start comparing. So that's essentially the novel. The group of girls are invited to help with renovations. Someone is sabotaging the renos, and it's because they're looking for a hidden treasure. So next I'll move on to the game. This is the third game that her interactive released for the Nancy Drew Adventure series, titled Message in a Haunted Mansion. The articles are slightly different in the title compared with the book, but basically it's the same thing. So in this version, it's just Nancy who's been invited to visit Hannah's friend, again, that's Rose, to help renovate the old mansion. She is aware that there have been frequent accidents, and it's putting them behind the renovation schedule. And the big question here is a ghost to blame? So we have a bit more of a supernatural element in the game. It is in the book, but a bit more prominent when it comes to the computer game. The characters are much the same. We have Rose Green, who of course is the one who has invited Nancy. Again, she has spent her life savings to buy this mansion. Then we have Abby. I don't know if it's Sidaris or Sidaris. I don't know if we ever hear how her last name is pronounced. But she's the former drama coach from River Heights and is a friend of Rose. So rather than being relatives, they're friends. And again, she's contributed her own money to help Rose buy this mansion. Next, we have Charlie Murphy, who is a young man who's helping with the renovations. We have Lewis Chandler, who owns a gallery called Chandler Interiors. And again, he's helping to advise with the antiques and decor for the mansion. And finally, we have Emily Foxworth. She's, again, a friend of Nancy. She's a photojournalist, and she's a phone contact in the game. We don't see her in person. Again, there are historical elements. So the 1906 earthquake, again, it's really key to why they can't find information on the history of the mansion. And then the figures, again, of Lizzie Applegate and El Diablo. And sort of the main focus here, along with trying to help with the renovations, is someone has been dealing these stunts, these hauntings, and someone has also been doing sabotage for treasure. And Nancy has to sort of differentiate between the two, because they are two separate things. So that's an overview of the game. And now we can do some comparisons between the two mediums. So as always, I like to start with the overall storyline or plot. So in the book, Nancy and her friends are invited to San Fran to help renovate a mansion. Many accidents occur before and after their arrival. The difference with the game is it's only Nancy who's there. Everything else about, what the point of the story is the same. Next, we'll look at the location. It's set in an old mansion in San Fran. In addition to that, the book also has sort of the neighborhood where the mansion is located. The girls go to Chandler Interiors. They also go to a nearby Chinese restaurant and even some other sites around the city. Third thing to look at are the character names. So it seems Her Interactive likes to make some adjustments to some number of characters in their early games, maybe even all the games. So in this one, we have two. I've made the assumption that Abby's last name is Green in the book because it's not outright stated, and she is a relative of Rose. She's her niece. In the computer game, they give her the last name Sidaris or Sidaris. Again, I'm not sure how they've chosen to pronounce that last name. And the second character whose name changed, and again it's a last name, is that of Charlie. In the book, his last name is Weber. In the computer game, it's Murphy. And again, I pose the question, why make the change? I don't mind the change, it's just me being curious. So next, I'd like to look at each of the characters individually and see what's changed and what's been left the same. So we'll start with Rose. So she's a friend of Hannah. She used her life savings to buy the mansion with the help of Abby. And then her dream is to turn it into a bed and breakfast. So that's the same between both mediums. If we wanted to look for any difference, Rose is described as having white hair in the book. She doesn't in the game, but that's it. Ultimately, she stays the same. So if we look at Abby next, so she helps Rose to buy the mansion, and she wants the guests to believe that the B&B is haunted. So that's sort of part of her motivation. That's consistent between book and game. In addition to that, in the book, she's the niece of Rose, and she's really self-conscious because she's overweight, she's a bit on the heavy side, and that comes up a couple times in the book. She also has a cat. He's a black cat named Alfreda. In the game, there's no cat, and Abby is a friend of Rose rather than a family member. She was a drama coach, and she seems to be much more confident than she was described as in the book. And she's created as a slim figure. I mean, that's something we see. They don't make her overweight. And I wonder why that was, why they chose to change her body image, her actual physical shape. Did they want her to be a bit more confident and to make her more believable as a suspect? And they thought maybe that would help with that. I don't know. I'm curious as to why they changed her from being a bit on the heavier side and making her rather slim. So that's something they changed, and that's one of the things I'm most curious about, why that decision was made. Next, we will move on to Charlie. He's a fair bit different. So in both stories, he helps with the renovations. He's the handyman. In the book, he's an older man. He's a bit of an older gentleman. He has a limp. He has a home. That's important. And he drives a cab part-time. He says that there's just not enough work for him to do renovations, despite the fact that there are a lot of people wanting to do renos in San Francisco. There are also a lot of people looking for that work. So he has to have 2 jobs. And in the book, he's also partly responsible for the incidents that occur at the mansion. He's been blackmailed to help Lewis sabotage the work. In the game, he's a young university student, and he secretly lives in the mansion's saloon. And this is taken from the character of Tim Coletti. So the computer game version of Charlie, they have essentially merged Charlie and Tim from the book. So they didn't need to have Tim as a separate character. It really would have been unnecessary, but it makes for an interesting character storyline. So I really like that they took those elements from Tim and put them in the character of Charlie. It makes him believable, and I think it's a nice touch to his character. So then we have Lewis. So he owns a store or gallery. I make note of the 2 differences because in the game he's sort of uptight and fussy and wants them to know he owns a gallery, not a store. Although in the book he simply calls it a store, and it's called Chandler Interiors, and he's supposedly helping Rose by advising her in buying antiques. And he kind of is, but he's also causing a lot of trouble along the way. He feigns the inability to find sort of historical documents and information about the property. But really that information can be found, you just have to do the research. But he doesn't want anyone to actually try. He doesn't want anyone to figure out the information he wants because he's trying to find this treasure. In the book, this isn't noted in the game, but in the book, he actually tried to outbid Rose when she was initially buying the property. And it's because of his high bid that Abby had to come in and provide financial assistance so that Rose could buy the mansion. And another thing that's different in the book, Emily finds out this information, Emily Foxworth. She finds an article involving Lewis Chandler, which indicates that he's a known treasure hunter. And when Nancy finds this out, it sort of sends up a red flag. She knows there's more to this guy that he hasn't told us. So speaking of Emily, let's look at her next. So she's a friend of Nancy and Hannah, and she's a photojournalist. So digging dirt is part of her job description. She's really good at it. She basically provides information in both stories. In the book, they actually note that she's been a previous character in another book in which Nancy and George help her with a case just on another time that they're in San Francisco. And in the game, she's a phone contact, so we don't see her as a physical character, but that's how they have her involved in the game's version of the story. And then we'll look at Mary Lee and her family. So they're not involved in the game at all. They're book only, strictly in the story, in the original novel. So Mary is a teenager. She works at her family's restaurant, and she's often nearby, partly because the restaurant is in the neighborhood that the mansion's in, but she also knows that Tim is hiding in the mansion, so she sneaks him food. And the reason I bothered to mention them is because her grandfather actually used to work at the Golden Gardenia Hotel, so that again is the property that Rose and Abby bought, and he's able to provide some historical information to the girls that is pretty important, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So the final character we'll look at is Tim, and like I said, he's basically been merged with the character of Charlie in the game. In the book, he's responsible for food theft at the mansion. So there have been many incidents that occur in the story in the book which include clear sabotage, some ghostly sightings, but they've also had problems with food going missing. He's responsible for that. He also unintentionally appears as a ghostly figure who looks like Lizzie Applegate. Bess sees him on a handful of occasions, and it's simply because his physical characteristics sort of match that of Lizzie. He has sort of long, curly golden hair, and they see him from the back and at night. So Bess thinks he's the ghost of Lizzie Applegate, and it's not something he meant to do. Just poor timing on when he's been seen. So then we'll look at those specific incidents. So there were, like I just mentioned, a few different things. So there have been hauntings, or apparent hauntings. There's stunts. There's been sabotage, and then food that's been stolen. So Abby is responsible for the ghostly appearances, except for that of Lizzie, which was, unintentionally due to Tim. So all the sort of spooky stuff Abby was doing, and it wasn't meant to be criminal, it was just to create this effect in the manor. Lewis, he's responsible for the sabotage, and he's done this in order to scare off Rose. He's hoping that he can then buy the mansion and find the treasure that he learns is probably in this property. In the book, Lewis has blackmailed Charlie into helping him with the accidents. So that's a little different, is it's not just Lewis, but it's Lewis and Charlie in the original story. And then sort of as noted already, from the book only, food is going missing occasionally. So then the last three things I want to compare, history and culture. So both versions of the story reference that devastating earthquake from 1906 and the loss of all the historical artifacts and information, which makes it hard for anyone to find out the history of various properties in San Francisco. The two mediums also tell the story of Lizzie Applegate, who's also E. Valdez, E standing for Elizabeth, Valdez being the last name she takes when she marries El Diablo. El Diablo's real name is Diego Valdez, and he was a gangster or a bandit. And Lizzie was sort of a performer, and she met El Diablo, and she joins his gang, and then there's this great Christmas gold robbery that occurs. She moves back to San Francisco, becomes an actress, and then there's all the mystery after the fire, after the earthquake that's destroyed the mansion. And they had this big question about, did she get the gold that El Diablo is believed to have taken in this robbery? So it's this other story that's intertwined with the renovations and sort of the reason for the sabotage that occurred at the site. And another thing is there's a lot of Chinese culture throughout the two mediums. In the book, we see it by going to the Chinese restaurant in the neighborhood, this new friendly acquaintance with the Lees and the information they can provide. And in the game, we have a lot of Chinese artifacts in the house. We have the Chinese room, and there are a lot of Hanzi symbols throughout as well. Speaking of Chinese information, we have gumbo fu. So there's this reference to gumbo fu in both book and game, and it means gold treasure mansion. In the book, Mary Lee's father had overheard the golden gardenia being referred to as gumbo fu when he was a child. So he sort of knew something about gold treasure mansion associated with Lizzie's property. And he tells the girls this when they do this outing with Mary and her family. In the game, Nancy sees mention of gumbo fu in a book. It's a book that Lewis has found in the library and hid in his briefcase. And it's Emily Foxworth who provides the translation for her. And then the final element to look at is the ending. And the ending is quite different between the mediums. So we'll start with the book, which is much more complicated than the game. So in the book, Nancy has figured out that Lewis is behind everything. She sort of suspects Charlie as well. So she and George rush off to the mansion to look for the gold, and Tim happens to arrive as well. And they find the gold hidden beneath the floorboards of where a fireplace used to be in the entry to the mansion. Then Lewis and Charlie arrive. Tim manages to run off so that he can alert the police. And using their hat pins, they're dressed up in these old costumes at the time. Nancy and George sort of attack Lewis with their sharp and pointy hat pins and are able to run out of the entryway, down into the saloon, and hide in the secret room that the men don't know about. That secret room also connects to the kitchen, so they then come up into the pantry where they know that there are fire extinguishers, and they hear the sirens, the police are on their way, and they then confront the men, spraying them with the fire extinguishers. And that's sort of how that ends. In the game, it's much more simple. There's no way really that they could have translated that original story into the game. Even with it just being Lewis, it just would have been too complex. And I don't think it would have been very fun. I think what they've done in the game is a lot better. It was a good decision. So in the game, Nancy finds the gold again in the floor beneath a phoenix emblem that's in the front entryway. Lewis sneaks up behind her, sort of briefly knocks her out. And while he's greedily trying to pull up all these coins and putting them in a bag, Nancy sort of stumbles off up one of the staircases and drops a chandelier on her attacker. And that's how he's caught, and that's how the game ends. So now just to look at some conclusions. So I do think the 2000, her interactive game, follows many plots and events from the original 1994 novel. So for instance, there's the fire. There's a fire that occurs with papers being burned in both the book and the game. Although if you've watched my playthrough of the game that I just uploaded, I managed to skip the fire. But in most playings of the game, the fire happens. There's a falling chandelier, which also happens at different points in the book. This chandelier has been placed sort of in the middle of the story. The girls come in, they slam the front door shut, and they have to slam the door, which everyone knows because it's crooked, it doesn't fit in the frame, and it causes the chandelier to sway. And one of the chain links has been filed down so that as soon as it started to swing, it would crash to the floor. So that it's sabotaged to fall in the book. In the game, it's how Lewis is caught. Nancy intentionally lets it fall onto the baddie. Another thing that's similar is the use of a library to track down historical information. In the game, there's a library on site in the mansion, whereas in the book, they actually have to go out into the city to get to a library. And then many aspects of the characters and their motivations remain the same. But there are significant changes to the story and those same characters. So as I said, most of the characters' sort of motivations are the same. Abby's young, she's helped Rose, she is into hauntings, but something that's changed is her physical description. She went from overweight to rather slim. If we look at Charlie, he's a handyman in both, but in the book he's an older man and he's responsible for some of the accidents. In the game, he's a teenager or a young adult because he's a university student. He has no home, he's secretly living in the mansion, and he's not responsible for accidents. And even the culprits are a little bit different. In the book, we have multiple culprits. Abby, if you want to call her a culprit for doing some of the hauntings. Tim inadvertently, by sort of looking like the ghost of Lizzie Applegate, but intentionally in terms of taking food. And then both Lewis Chandler and Charlie Weber responsible for the so-called accidents. Whereas in the computer game, yes, again to Abby being responsible for the hauntings, but Charlie is not involved with the accidents. That is all Lewis. The game takes place in just one location, which really works. You're stuck in the old mansion with all these beautiful detailed rooms to explore, whereas the book has a bunch of scenes throughout the city, and naturally they've been removed. It's just too much to try to include in the game, and even they could have put a few spots like maybe Chandler Interiors or the restaurant, but they weren't necessary for the way that Her Interactive told the story. So with whatever has been changed and whatever has been kept, ultimately the main storyline remains the same. Nancy, with her friends in the book, come to San Francisco to help renovate a Victorian mansion. Someone is causing accidents and searching for loot that's been hidden in the old house. Lewis is the culprit, although in the book he also has Charlie's help. And that's it for our conclusions and comparisons. I do think that it's a pretty good change from book to game. I mean, they kept, again, so the essence of the story is the same. It was left unchanged. Some of the characters were tweaked, but in a way that I think worked really, really well. Her interactive's transformation from book to game is pretty great. Actually, almost more than pretty great, because I love the game. I think I like the computer game better than I like the novel, and maybe because I've played the game many times and I played it before I ever read the book. But they've done a splendid job. I think they've told the story incredibly well. The execution was perfect. You really get the sense of being in a haunted mansion, which is part of the point of the story. The only thing I sort of question, and this is not to do with her interactive or the game or like anything comparison, I do wonder about the title, The Message in the Haunted Mansion. I wonder where the message comes in, because you don't really have a message or a secret note or a historical note that they're looking into. I really wonder about the title and the use of the word message in the title. Otherwise, I think it's an aptly named story, and I think it's really quite good. So with that, I think I'm going to end this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you found, well, I say this all the time, but I hope you found it interesting. I think it's quite interesting to see the differences between the original story and this recreation. I find it almost fascinating, and this one in particular has been really neat because there's so many elements in the original story, and seeing what they managed to keep in the game, what they thought was worth keeping. Keeping the game just to the mansion rather than to other locations, I thought was a wise decision. All right, I definitely don't have anything more to say now. I'll let you all go. Thank you for taking the time to click on this video and to watch and or listen. And I look forward to doing another one in the near future. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.